Okay, we're continuing with our mystical Hebrew alphabet series. We're on the letter Hey. And Hey, we said before, is a combination of the physical Dalet with the spiritual Yud. And it represents the integration or the completion of these two opposite ideas, physicality integrated with spirituality. We see that the large Dalet of the Hey, the large physicality, hides a spiritual core. Then we said the gender masculine typically lacks the Hey that integrates the physical and spiritual together in terms of grammar. And the feminine gender has that Hey typically, which integrates the physical and spiritual together. Masculine was to give over or to affect outside yourself. Feminine was to take something, work on it, raise it to a higher level. And that's why the feminine side is the side that actually expresses out the higher level idea that the masculine side was giving over. So the feminine mechanism is using rules and limitations to take ideas to a higher level. We said that is exemplified by the word for ish, a man. A man's unique letter that he does not have in common with the isha, they have the aleph shin root in common, is his yud. A man reaches in and up for that yud of spirituality and we give it over, and therefore the masculine side is the side that transmits, it's a pipeline of spirituality into the world. The job of the feminine side is to go out into the Dalet of the physical world and express out the hidden spirituality inside. So the feminine side is the side of expression. We said last time that creates a system of flow down spirituality into this world, and then that spirituality gets its expression where the physical world gets taken to a higher level. That is a feminine process. So we talked about how that impacts relationships last time. Weaknesses, when the male side is giving over, in his brain everything seems equally outside of him, therefore he gives over and affects it. He doesn't have a sense of how it's affecting him back. The feminine side uses rules and limitations to take something to a higher level. Rules and limitations create a filter. A filter is yes, this, no, that. And rules and limitations are yes, this, no, that. So therefore, the feminine side tends to be less vulnerable to the messages coming in and bombarding it from the outside, because filtering implies a certain selectivity as to what they're going to take to a higher level, as opposed to the masculine side that sees everything safely outside of himself, and therefore there's very little protection as to what's bouncing back. My favorite example of this is my wife and I were helping to run a beginners synagogue in a northern suburb of Toronto in the early 1990s, and Madonna, who's a pop singer, was doing a North American tour, and she was coming to visit Toronto. And I had heard that her concerts were not like folk concerts in the 1960s. They were more provocative in terms of dancers and messages. They were more like appropriate for Las Vegas as opposed to something that would be family oriented. So I had 7 young married couples in a home study group, and I asked my 7 young married couples, I didn't ask them if they liked her music. At the time, everybody liked her music, so that was a wasted question. But I asked them if they thought there was a problem with going to the concert. And I had 7 married couples who were totally secular, and the 7 husbands, shook their head no, and the 7 wives shook their head yes, which I thought was hysterical because it was just textbook, the difference between masculine and feminine. And then the husbands looked at their wives like, what are you talking about? Like, what's wrong with going to the concert? And the wives were like, no, I don't want you going to that concert. It's not good for you. So in a man's world, the concert was over there. We don't have a sense of how it's bouncing back and affecting us. So the men's attitude was, what do you think I'm going to do? Climb up on stage and dance with them? And the women were like, no, it's not. I can't compete with those messages. I can't sing like she does. I can't dance like they do. So therefore, it's not good for our relationship. And I think it was very confusing for the husbands because years earlier, before they were married, they would have all gone to the concert. So I think it boiled down to either the wives, when they were girlfriends, either didn't realize how difficult marriage can be, and therefore weren't sensitive to the messages that these concerts sent, or maybe had they said, listen, I don't think this is good for us, then the boyfriend would have just said, well, I'll go with somebody else. So there's a typical case of everything being outside of us, and we're not filtering the same way, so we're much more vulnerable to these types of messages. So I think you can see that in the advertising industry. When Toyota wants a guy to buy the brand new car, so what do they typically do with the ads for the last, whatever it is, 40, 50 years? So they'll take the brand new car and surround it with pretty girls, because in a guy's world, the car and the girls are equally outside of him. So it makes sense somewhere in his brain that one relates to the other. But when Toyota wants a woman to buy a brand new car, they don't typically surround it with pretty boys, because it's a commercial, so it doesn't have the same impact. What they'll typically do is show the woman that you as a woman deep down inside want to be, and she has a loving husband smiling at her, and she has 2 happy kids, looking up at her, and there's a happy dog waving its tail, and they all will jump in the car and live happily ever after. And that's taking an idea to a higher level. That's what's going to appeal to the feminine side, a relationship that can be taken to a higher level, as opposed to the external messages of the car and the models standing around the car are all the same thing. So I think that that's a typical case of a male weakness versus a more feminine strength. Now, the question really is, where did the feminine side pick up its weaknesses? And I think a lot has to do with the last, let's say, 40 years of messages. The women's liberation movement in the 1960s, in my opinion anyway, had a lot of good messages about equal opportunity in the workplace or equal pay for equal work. But there was a message in there that created a risk on the feminine side. And that message is, whatever men can do, we can do, or whatever men can do, we can do better. And the question is, should men be doing whatever it is that the feminine side was trying to emulate? Should men be doing that in the first place? And I remember the 60s and the early 70s from my childhood, and the messages of women, you too can be a successful male, created a tendency for women to start adopting male weaknesses. Because there were a lot of unhappy men out there with that attitude of looking at the world maybe from an incomplete perspective, and women said, well, we can do that also. And I'm not so sure that was a healthy message for women. I remember there's an excerpt from Mary Tyler Moore wrote an autobiography about going to Hollywood and becoming a successful producer. When she was very young, she was a comedian on television, and she saw that all the successful producers in Hollywood were all rich, powerful, and male, and she thought, well, that's ridiculous. Whatever they can do, I can do. She became very active in the women's liberation movement. She wrote her autobiography in 1995, and she was very successful. She formed her own production company called MTM, Mary Tyler Moore, and had hit after hit after hit. So I looked at that memoir she wrote, and she looked back at the previous 30 years, and she had really achieved all those goals of being a successful producer. And she wrote that if she had it to do over again, she would have been a wife and a mother and not set out in the course she set out in, because she says that her friends, her wives and mothers ended up happy, and she became a rich, powerful Hollywood producer. She was miserable. But maybe a close examination of those other male, rich, powerful Hollywood producers would have seen that they were miserable. So that's a risk. You have to be very careful. And it's not that Judaism or the Torah is anti-career. My wife has always had a career. The career's, I don't think, the problem. The problem is that society tends to cause us to define ourselves by what we do as opposed to who we are. And you have to keep a healthy perspective because there's a push to making money and making a name for yourself, and that defines how great a person you are, and that's a secular message, that's not a Torah message. So let's say you always wanted a career, let's say you always wanted to be a lawyer. So fine. So you could end up, as a woman, the top lawyer in your law firm. But take my word for it, if one day you walk into your boss's office and say, listen, I've thought about this for the last year, I don't want to be a lawyer anymore. I'm burned out. And he says, no, you're a top lawyer. I'll give you a raise. I'll give you better, perks. I'll give you a better office, whatever it is. Don't leave. And you say, no, I'm not here to negotiate. I really don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to leave. I'm pretty confident that he can pick up the phone and replace you, no matter how good a lawyer you are. Almost any career is replaceable. It's usually a phone call, and there's usually a stack of resumes sitting on the person's desk. I say that to myself all the time. If I didn't want to be an educator anymore, I'm also replaceable. The one thing that you will do in your lifetime that people will not pick up the phone call and replace is wife and mother, or husband, father. And people have to keep that in mind. I think that that's an important message. They don't write on your tombstone, beloved lawyer. They write beloved wife, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. And that says something. So this push to define yourself by a career is possibly an unhealthy message that stems from the women's liberation movement of whatever men can do, we can do better. Because for a lot of men, it was not healthy for them to define themselves by their careers either. And, for a male, you lose your career, you can lose your identity. So it's not about career, it's about who you are and how to take ideas to a higher level and how to be a healthy expresser of spiritual messages in the physical world. That's just a lesson of what the push to be more male can do in terms of damaging the feminine side. Now, there are interesting examples of this. Many years ago, I remember it was during the Gulf War in the early 1990s, I was over someone's house trying to see what was happening in Israel on cable news. And they turned on a news show called 60 Minutes. And it was an hour sort of news program weekly. And they do 2 or 3 topics during that hour. The topic that they picked was a fascinating look at what secular society defines as a successful woman. Who is the successful woman? What does she look like? Now, I don't know why 60 Minutes, this would have been January, when did we invade Iraq? Maybe January 1991. Why they picked what a successful woman looks like, I don't know, but the way they did it to see who she is they took TV ads and they put 3 30-second ads side by side, each one featuring what people called a successful woman. And they actually went to Charlie perfume, which was marketed from the early 1960s. I think Charlie was a Revlon product or something, and they took 30 seconds ads of Charlie perfume, and the advertising company always wanted to portray what a successful woman looked like in these ads. And so if you go back to the first ad they showed in the early 60s, the woman who wore Charlie was in a skirt, and there were happy children playing on the carpet behind her. Her husband comes home from work, puts down his briefcase. She gives him a hug and a kiss hello. She wears Charlie because she's a successful homemaker. I think there was a dining room table set for dinner in the background. That was the early 60s. Then the women's liberation movement kicks in the mid to late 60s, and they changed the ad. And now the woman who wore Charlie, if I remember correctly, comes through the door in pants, meaning she's not housebound anymore. There's no kids playing on the carpet behind her. There's no table set up for dinner. Her husband comes home shortly afterwards, puts his briefcase down, hangs up his coat, gives her a hug and a kiss hello, and she's the woman who's getting out now. By the third commercial, which would have been in the, I guess, mid to late 70s, they modified the commercial so that her husband's home, we don't know why, it's only a 30-second commercial. She comes through the door in a smart business outfit. She puts down her briefcase, she hangs up her coat, she gives him a hug and a kiss hello. She wears Charlie perfume. She's a successful career woman. By the 1980s, they modified the commercial so that she drives her Porsche to the beach. She gets out of the car, she puts her foot on the bumper, the wind blows through her hair, and she wears Charlie perfume because the Porsche loves how she smells because there's no men in the commercial. So that idea that she's got her money, she's got her Porsche, she's got her lifestyle, she doesn't really need anybody else, I think is a clear-cut push towards male weakness. That's a very male weak way of looking at the world of, I've got my entertainment. If I need somebody, I'll find somebody. It doesn't make sense why a perfume commercial would only have a car in it, because a car can't smell or perfume anyway. So it's a very strange example of what I think society was doing to push women towards male weaknesses.